Olá a todas e todos, este é mais uma vez o BDF Entrevista Internacional. Uma vez por mês trazemos figuras políticas internacionais para debater temas globais. Hoje temos um programa muito especial. Nós trazemos aqui o editor-chefe do Wikileaks, Kristinn Hrafnsson. Well, it's nice to have you here with us, Mr. Hrafnsson.
I'm honored to be here.
Kristinn Hrafnsson é jornalista investigativo e editor-chefe do Wikileaks desde 2010. Antes disso, se destacou na imprensa da Islândia, especialmente na cobertura sobre o derretimento da economia do país diante da crise dos bancos de 2008. Em 2010, foi ao Iraque fazer uma investigação das ações dos Estados Unidos, publicada no Wikileaks como Collateral Damage.
So, the first question I want to make, I want to start this debate if you can access the legacy of WikiLeaks work regarding journalism in the sense of the importance when we look at the global violence, interventions and wars since the beginning of the 2000s. How do you see the legacy of WikiLeaks works?
I think the legacy of WikiLeaks will, in historical terms, when people reflect back, been quite extraordinary, and it comes on many layers. If you think about this period of this century, there's always a difficulty putting some starting point in an era, but let's say a certain era started in 9/11 with the attack on the United States. What followed was a dark spin in politics and an attack on human rights in Western countries, and also these horrible wars that followed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then the drone wars in several countries and what have you. So it marked a turning point in global politics, which was undermining the security of individuals in many aspects. We see attacks on press freedom. We see attack on privacy. We see, of course, direct violence, military violence, and police violence. This is happening all over the world, and this is instigated by this attack by this one man in the cave in Afghanistan. So I would say secrecy by Western powers increased dramatically. You can see that in basically graphs on for example, on the amount of documents that were put into secrecy category in the United States. We saw corporate secrecy increased as well. So on all level there was a decline, and journalism did not have the right answer for it. The introduction of the scientific journalism that Julian Assange created with the website, and the idea that we can push back by creating a platform for whistleblowers to submit information, raw information, that can then be analyzed and published in entirety. I say scientific because that's the scientific method to basically provide the raw material to the individual so they can double check and investigate by themselves. But of course also we entered into this cooperation with mainstream media and media all over the world, and even French media, or whatever you call it, to analyze the material that was published. So it was an explosion, watershed, I would say, in terms of journalism. The publications of the files from Iraq and Afghanistan, I'm referring to the military files, the 250,000 documents from the Department of State in the US, the diplomatic cables, the files from the assessment files of the inmates in Guantanamo Bay. It ripped open a totally new reality. And the impact, of course, was tremendous in political terms. And I think we are seeing a changed world after that. Of course, the political impact was quite obvious. In the beginning, it sparked a process or helped escalate what we call now the Arab Spring, or the Arab Awakening. And it calls into question the legitimacy of this abuse of the empire of its position. It also created material for a lot of people to actually get justice that had not been deprived of justice, of war crimes or renditions So the material that we published has been used to get some form of justice for those who were wronged, to end the impunity of war crimes and illegal acts against, for example, rendition people. It was used in, for example, in the El Masri case in the European Court of Human Rights, and was a very important document and proof. The documents from the diplomatic cable can be said to have led to the final withdrawals of all troops from Iraq, because the Iraqi government, after there was some elements were established in the diplomatic cables about wrongdoing and cover-up of abuses in the country after 2003, the government in Iraq could no longer provide the US military with a commitment of total sanctuary for all wrongdoing, and that led to the withdrawal of troops from Iraq. But the other important story, which is often overlooked because it's ongoing, is the exposure which are inherent in the reaction by the United States of America and other countries that are collaborating with the US and how they responded to these leaks. And that is a very important story that is still ongoing, with the imprisonment of Julian Assange, with the attack on the organization and other who work for the organization. That is an ongoing story, and the proof of how far the superpower is willing to go in the act of revenge is astonishing. And that story, the reaction story, will probably be, in historical terms, as important story as of the Wikileaks story. It is the action and then the reaction. And that often happens in journalism. I mean, the most famous example, of course, is Watergate. It was not the stealing of the papers, but it was the cover-up and the lies, and the break-in into the Watergate building, and the cover-up and the lies about it that caused the resignation of Nixon. So you have, and that is, of course, the ongoing story that we are dealing with at the moment, which we would happily be without, because as journalists we want to be doing our jobs. But this is now happened to be my job and my colleagues to put all the emphasis that we have on trying to end this persecution and this violence against Julian Assange and this lawfare that is ongoing, because we recognize, as all major organizations in the world today, that this is an attack not just on Julian and Wikileaks, it's an attack on press freedom worldwide.
So if I may, you mentioned Watergate, and that was a famous case of exposure. If you could elaborate a little bit more on that, thinking about context, what it is different from the 70s in concerning actually also what you said about the persecution or the reaction to journalists and journalistic endeavors in the 70s and in the 2000s?
Well, the comparison is chilling in many respects, because I think we tend to look back at the 70s as being the dark period of Nixon era, where the bad things happened. But actually the Nixon era and the bad things happening in that framework of time is much less severe than what we are witnessing today. So we are in a much more precarious situation, and journalism is under much severe attack today than it was back in the day. Just as an illustration, Daniel Ellsberg, who was the person who leaked the Pentagon Papers in the same period and indirectly had an effect on the Nixon resignation, told me, because he's a huge supporter and he came to London, and he said that if I had been doing what I did as a whistleblower today instead of in the early 70s, I would have never seen a day as a free man. I would never have been gotten off. They would have locked me up for the rest of my life under the certain regime, under the certain the same sort of situation that Julian Assange is dealing with. So we are, and that's a chilling thing to say. We haven't progressed, we have regressed. We are now at a worst worse state than 50 years ago.
So you already started talking about this, but so we talk about the legacy of WikiLeaks. What are the challenges today? And we can think about important things that happened a year ago. The U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in a terrible way. We have the Ukrainian war now. How WikiLeaks, but not only WikiLeaks, journalists, initiatives can help, maybe can help build, I would say, a more peaceful world, or if not peaceful, a more accountable world.
I agree with Julian Assange when he said that our primary aim should be to stop wars, not just to expose the wrongdoing in wars. And we are not there yet. We have to admit that. You talk about the Afghanistan, which is the longest war that the US has entered into, ended in a rather humiliating manner for them after billions of dollars of expenses, and the human cost in human lives that is, of course, you cannot count in monetary value. If people had paid more attention to the Afghan files that were published in 2010, this would have ended sooner. It would have been 10, 12 years instead of 20 years. Because there was nothing new in the evaluation that led to the decision, okay, let's end it. That was not already there in the files 10 years earlier. So this is, in fact, a bit disappointing that it was not, did not create more attention to actually quicken the end of this horrible spectacle that was not going anywhere. How can we contribute to preventing wars? It is a difficult situation, and it is getting more and more difficult because there are forces in play in our societies internationally that are working against any chance of that becoming a success.
So I'd like to know your opinion on something we can maybe call a new phenomenon, right? Which is fake news. And in Brazil, we had this experience, especially in 2018, right? Maybe less on this last election, but Bolsonaro was elected in 2018, not only because of that, but that gave a push for him. Fake news. How journalists, or how we as journalists should look at that, especially when you're talking about WikiLeaks, which is a project that it's so careful to talk about the truth.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is humongous. It's a massive problem, and it's not just a Brazilian problem. It's a universal problem. It is something that is being hurting the people everywhere in the world and the democratic process. And it's not easy to deal with it, because it's easy to fall into a trap of introducing medicine that will kill the patient. We do not want that. We do not want to get into a place where we are increasing censorship to stop fake news. That is conflicting agendas that will not lead to a good thing, in my opinion. I'm very wary of all sort of attempts to divert in that direction. But the problem is certainly there, and the problem, of course, we know where it springs from. You talked about the right. Yes, the right wing is the general principal actor in the spreading of disinformation. But they are not the only one. And the mainstream media, even on the liberal left, bear some responsibility to have followed suit in that shouting out of spreading of disinformation, and the powers in our world are certainly not innocent in the field as well, and it is taken very seriously as a weapon by intelligence agencies, for example, to use disinformation to actively push out a certain agenda, and that is part of the propaganda war. So they are guilty as well of adding to that problem. And all too many journalists fall into the trap of being manipulated by these powers. You say it's a new thing. I don't think in general it's a new thing. It's always been there to some extent, but in the scale of it and the political seriousness, that of course is escalated by the fact that we do have these new actors in the field, or new elements in the field. The technology to spread information is way bigger and more effective than before. And then we have the social media, who are becoming way too powerful in the social sphere. It is. I've been watching with some amazement the stories, for example, lately about Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and everybody is shouting and screaming on the liberal left and in the mainstream about how serious this is for democracy. And I said, this is the wrong question. You should be asking, why does it matter that some crazy American owns a social media platform? How did we allow, and what can we do about the fact that these platforms are so instrumental in our democratic process, if correct? And is that an unhealthy position per se? Should we do something about that? We need to zoom out and see the problem in entirety. So the problem is not Elon Musk. The problem is that social media plays such a huge role in our democratic process, opening the way to abuse and strong propaganda to basically poison our process. And one thing to add, so when we are dealing with forces that are, in essence, anti-democratic, and let's be basically clear about that. I don't really care what we call it, what label we put on it, whether it's here in Brazil or in the US or elsewhere, whether you call it neo-fascist, fascist, neo-conservative, or ultra-right, or what have you. It is a common problem, it's a common theme, and it's everywhere rising and drowning out the political sphere. And that this is an anti-democratic force.
So one of all those things we discussed, one of the most important things regarding freedom of speech and accountability is the persecution and arrest of Julian Assange right now. So first, my question would be if you could give us briefly the current situation of Assange's situation.
Well, his situation is very precarious. If we just look at the individual and the personality and his health situation, it is declining, as is natural and normal for somebody who has been deprived of freedom for all this time under this immense pressure. Julian has been deprived of full freedom for 12 years now. House arrest, asylum in the Ecuador embassy, without any access to daylight or exercise outdoors for 7 years, and now 3.5 years in a maximum security prison in London, waiting and fighting against the extradition. So that is his situation is not good. His health has declined, and it should not be which is expected of somebody who has endured so much. Legally, he is now fighting against the extradition in the court, and we are now waiting for the High Court in London to evaluate the request for an appeal. We fully appreciate, fully expect that this will be they will hear the appeal. It would be scandalous if they would not hear the appeal. The answer to that question will come in the next days or weeks, and then there will be a court case and hearing, and in that hearing, all the most serious stories of violations against Julian will be, for the first time, heard in an appeal court, and with the added evidence that have come since the first round. For example, the news report that the CIA was plotting to kidnap or kill Julian in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2017, which by itself should be enough to prove that he will not stand a chance of any fair trial in the United States, and therefore the extradition should collapse. So this is the situation that if everything goes to the worst, he might be on a rendition plane to the US in the next weeks. So time is running out for us. We don't, and we have to take into account the worst case scenario. So that is the reason why we are taking an increased step on getting on board as many political forces as possible to solve this on a political platform, because in the essence of it, it has nothing to do with the laws. That is what has been exposed in all these proceedings in London courtroom. Despite the facade of justice in a very fancy courtrooms with judges with wigs on their heads, what has been exposed through the entire process, that this has nothing to do with the law. It's a pure political persecution.
If you could explain to me briefly, you mentioned there is a lawsuit against Mike Pompeo, right, from Spanish courts regarding this assassinate attempt against Assange.
Well, actually, there are several lawsuits where Mike Pompeo is implicated. One is by Julian's lawyers and journalists who were visiting him in the embassy and who were spied upon by the CIA when Mike Pompeo was director of the agency. And of course, he later became the Secretary of State in Trump's government. So he is implicated in that case. That's an American case, which is launched in America, and Mike Pompeo has been subpoenaed to appear in that court case. There is another case ongoing in Madrid, and that is against the security company that worked on behalf of the CIA in installing all this spying on Julian and everybody who visited him and broke the rights of his rights and everybody who visited. That case is in the courts in Madrid and is ongoing. In that case, the magistrate judge in Madrid has requested Mike Pompeo's presence as former director of the CIA, as it is obvious that he must have had knowledge and approve of this outrageous operation. So there are many fronts to fight on, and in the pushback, revelations have come forth which are, astonishing in this time and age. Astonishing.
So when you mentioned, so in the beginning you mentioned the reaction against Wikileaks and this kind of journalism enterprise, and now you mentioned about the espionage of some cases. Can we say, and I mentioned, for example, the scandal of the Pegasus spyware, an Israeli app that was revealed was spying on journalists and activists. That this would be part of the reaction. I mean, governments and even corporations may be trying to spy and persecute people like Assange.
Yeah, governments, corporations, and government in collusion with corporations. That is the ongoing trend that is extremely serious and needs to be addressed. Yes, that has been ongoing. Of course, the revelation of Edward Snowden, which we helped him to get to security, was astonishing, especially to Americans who are rather sensitive to spying on their private matters. But these elements have been growing, and it's a part of the same trend. It did not stop in 2010. It escalated in 2010. But it was a trend that had started earlier, and unfortunately, for example, it didn't seem to matter who was in the White House at the time, whether it was a Democrat or Republican. It manifested, for example, in the outrageous escalation under the Obama administration in their war against whistleblowers. And I mean, you can go on the internet and find, outcries from Obama when he was campaigning before 2008, that he would take special care of protecting the rights of whistleblowers. What happened? Under Obama, more whistleblowers were prosecuted under the Espionage Act than in the terms of all presidents before him combined. We said at the time, this is extremely serious, because this is a step in one direction and one direction only. They will go after whistleblowers and calling them spies and abuse this Espionage Act. Then they will come after journalists. And unfortunately, we were right. And it was not until the abuse of the Espionage Act against Julian Assange that the chilling effect of it really hit in. And this is so it's part of a trend. And yes, it is all part of the same fight for truth and human rights.
One last question. So you talk a little about that, but in thinking about the worst case scenario regarding Assange and the what would be the consequences of that? And so because of that, why it's so important for political progressive forces, even governments? I saw you met Gustavo Petro in Colombia, but also Lula will take mandates in January. Why is it important to fight back against this, as you said, horrible trend?
Well, the case against Julian Assange and Wikileaks is a test case. And it's a test case of our resolve, but it's also a test case by the forces that we are fighting, the evil forces, on how far they can take it. It will set a precedent on how governments will deal with the media. If they are successful in extraditing Julian Assange and put him up on trial as a spy and lock him up for the rest of his life, that will send a signal that they can go on the same road elsewhere, anywhere in the world. And it will put in jeopardy the safety of all journalists everywhere, including in Colombia, where we just came from, and including here in Brazil, where we're hoping to get manifested support from President-elect Lula. And there's a strong realization that this is the case, and the danger is there. There is a misconception that we are just fighting for Julian. Julian is a friend of mine, and certainly I would fight for him in any way, but he is just the face of a huge problem. It is about press freedom worldwide. It's about human rights worldwide. It's a part of our general pushback against the attack on decency and the core values that constitute this thin layer that is our current civilization. If we don't push back, we're gone.
Thank you very much, Hrafnsson.
Thanks for having me.
Esse foi mais BDF Entrevista Internacional. Recebemos aqui Kristinn Hrafnsson, editor-chefe do Wikileaks, e mês que vem estamos de volta. Na próxima semana você vê o BDF Entrevista, que vai trazer mais um tema relevante da política nacional, dos temas nacionais, da discussão do Brasil de fato. Até a próxima.